What if I told you that one of the most destructive and feared substances on the planet was once marketed as a safe, non-addictive cure for the common cough? Imagine walking into a pharmacy and buying a bottle of it for your child's cold, right off the shelf, no questions asked. This isn't a dystopian fantasy. This is the unbelievable, true story of how the company that gave us aspirin also gave the world heroin. Yes, that heroin. For over a decade, it was a celebrated wonder drug, a global bestseller, and a staple in medicine cabinets from New York to Berlin. It was hailed as a medical miracle, a heroic solution to suffering. But this miracle had a monstrous secret, a dark side that would create a crisis that still haunts us to this very day. How did this happen? How did a company like Bayer unleash such a powerful demon upon the world? And why did doctors and patients welcome it with open arms? The story is a shocking cocktail of good intentions, corporate greed, scientific hubris, and a catastrophic misunderstanding of addiction. Prepare yourself, because the truth is far stranger and far more terrifying than you could ever imagine. To understand this colossal mistake, we need to travel back in time to the late 19th century. The world of medicine was a wild, unregulated frontier. It was an era of miracle elixirs and patent medicines, where bold claims were printed on colorful labels with little to no scientific backing. Doctors had a limited arsenal of effective treatments, and one of their most powerful tools was opium and its derivatives, like morphine and codeine. These opiates were lifesavers. They were the most effective painkillers known to humanity, and were brilliant at suppressing the brutal, racking coughs that came with deadly diseases like tuberculosis and pneumonia. A persistent cough wasn't just an annoyance. It was often a death sentence, exhausting patients and preventing them from getting the rest they needed to fight off infection. Morphine could quiet that cough, offering precious relief, but it came at a terrible price. Morphine was notoriously addictive. Patients treated for pain or coughs often developed a dependency that was incredibly difficult to break. It also had severe side effects, including respiratory depression, which could be fatal. Doctors were caught in a terrible dilemma: relieve a patient suffering with a drug that could enslave or kill them, or watch them suffer without it. The medical community was desperately searching for a holy grail, a drug with all the power of morphine but none of the addiction, none of the danger. A clean opiate. The company that could invent such a drug wouldn't just make a fortune, they would change the world. And in Germany, a chemical and pharmaceutical giant named Bayer was poised to do just that. Enter Felix Hoffmann. Hoffmann was a brilliant young chemist working in the labs of Bayer in Elberfeld, Germany. In the late summer of 1897, he was on an incredible hot streak. Just a couple of weeks earlier, on August 10th, he had successfully synthesized a stable form of acetylsalicylic acid, a compound that would later be marketed as aspirin. But that wasn't his primary goal. His main project was to tackle the morphine problem head-on. The directive from his superiors was clear: find a way to modify the morphine molecule to make it safer and less addictive. The prevailing theory at the time was that morphine's negative side effects, including its addictive properties, were linked to a specific part of its chemical structure. Hoffmann hypothesized that by adding a chemical group, an acetyl group, to the morphine molecule, he could neutralize its harmful effects while enhancing its therapeutic benefits. On August 21, 1897, just 11 days after creating aspirin, Hoffmann cooked up a batch of morphine and treated it with acetic anhydride. The result was a new, refined, white crystalline powder, diacetylmorphine. It was a semi-synthetic opioid, a chemical cousin to morphine, but seemingly different. Initial tests on laboratory animals were astounding. The new compound appeared to be far more potent than morphine as a painkiller, and crucially, seemed to cause less nausea and respiratory depression at effective doses. The researchers at Bayer were ecstatic. They believed they had done it. They had tamed morphine. They thought they had created the perfect, safe opiate the world had been waiting for. They had no idea they had just created a monster. With a potential blockbuster drug on their hands, Bayer's marketing department needed a name. Diacetylmorphine was a mouthful. It was clunky, scientific, and forgettable. They needed something powerful, something that captured the incredible feeling the drug produced in early test subjects. Workers and researchers at the Bayer factory who sampled the new substance reported a remarkable sense of well-being. They described feeling invigorated, strong, and euphoric. The drug didn't just kill pain or stop a cough, it made them feel larger than life. Based on these powerful testimonials, the marketing team chose a name derived from the German word heroisch, which means heroic. And so, diacetylmorphine was christened Heroin. It was the perfect name for a wonder drug. It sounded strong, dependable, and heroic. It promised not just relief, but victory over sickness. It was a marketer's dream, a name that perfectly encapsulated the drug's perceived power and benevolence. Bayer patented the name Heroin in 1898, alongside Aspirin. They were positioned as two revolutionary products from the same trusted company, ready to conquer the global market. One would become the world's most common pain reliever. The other would become its most infamous narcotic. At the time, no one could possibly tell the difference. They were simply two heroic solutions from a cutting-edge company. Bayer launched one of the most aggressive and widespread marketing campaigns the pharmaceutical world had ever seen. Heroin was the star of the show. The company sent thousands of free samples to doctors across Europe and the United States, accompanied by promotional literature filled with glowing claims and enthusiastic testimonials. The ads were bold and unequivocal. Heroin was declared to be 10 times more effective as a cough suppressant than codeine, but without the unpleasant side effects. It was promoted as a treatment for a vast array of respiratory ailments: asthma, bronchitis, emphysema, and especially the dreaded tuberculosis, the white plague of the 19th century. But the most audacious claim, the one that would prove to be so catastrophically wrong, was that heroin was non-addictive. In fact, Bayer went even further. They marketed heroin as a cure for morphine addiction. The logic, twisted as it seems now, was that patients addicted to morphine could be weaned off it by switching to the safer, alternative heroin. It was fighting fire with gasoline, but at the time, it was presented as sound medical science. The campaign was a phenomenal success. Doctors, desperate for better treatments, embraced the new drug. Medical journals published articles praising its efficacy. Heroin was soon sold in various forms to suit every need. It came as a powder, in tablets, in water-soluble salts for injection, and most popularly in cough syrups, elixirs, and lozenges. Bayer even produced a glycerin-based syrup with heroin specifically for children, advertised to soothe their coughs and help them sleep. Ads appeared in newspapers and magazines, targeting the general public directly. One ad from the era proclaimed, "Bayer's heroin hydrochloride, for coughs, bronchitis, and all affections of the lungs." It was available over the counter in most countries, including the United States. You could walk into your local drugstore and buy a bottle of heroin as easily as you could buy a bar of soap. Trust in the Bayer brand was absolute. This wasn't some back-alley potion. This was a modern scientific marvel from a world-renowned German company. Between 1898 and 1910, heroin was a medical and commercial triumph. It was one of the most profitable drugs in Bayer's portfolio. The company exported it to over 23 countries, and its sales soared year after year. For a while, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Doctors were thrilled with the results. Heroin worked. It worked incredibly well. As a cough suppressant or antitussive, its power was undeniable. For patients in the final, agonizing stages of tuberculosis, a disease characterized by relentless, body-racking coughing, heroin was a godsend. It quieted the cough, eased their breathing, and allowed them to get precious, pain-free rest. In an era before antibiotics, this symptomatic relief was the best medicine had to offer. It gave patients a measure of peace and dignity in their final days. Testimonials from physicians flooded in, and Bayer proudly published them. One American doctor wrote that heroin was a most valuable and indispensable remedy in the treatment of diseases of the respiratory tract. A German professor of medicine declared it superior to morphine, noting its complete freedom from any unpleasant aftereffects. Hospitals in the United States began adding it to their official formularies, making it a standard treatment. St. Louis Medical Society held a meeting where they discussed its many benefits, particularly for treating pneumonia and asthma. The drug's popularity wasn't just confined to the terminally ill. Because it was so effective and widely available, it became a go-to remedy for everyday coughs and colds. People from all walks of life, from laborers to aristocrats, kept a bottle of Bayer's heroin elixir in their medicine cabinet. It was seen as modern, effective, and above all, safe. For a golden, deceptive decade, heroin was the heroic drug it promised to be. It was the toast of the medical world, a testament to Bayer's innovative genius. But beneath the surface of this success story, a disaster was brewing. The miracle was about to unravel. The first warning signs were subtle, easily dismissed as anomalies. Around the turn of the century, a few doctors began to report a strange phenomenon in patients who took heroin for an extended period. They were developing a tolerance. The initial dose that had worked so well to silence their cough would gradually lose its effect. To get the same relief, patients needed more of the drug, and then more again. This dose escalation was a classic hallmark of opiate dependency, but the non-addictive marketing was so powerful that many in the medical community were slow to connect the dots. Then, more troubling reports began to surface. Patients who tried to stop taking heroin experienced a brutal withdrawal syndrome. They suffered from insomnia, chills, sweating, muscle aches, vomiting, and an overwhelming, desperate craving for the drug. It was the same agonizing withdrawal seen in morphine addicts, but many observers noted that it seemed to come on faster and with a greater intensity. The illusion of a safe, non-addictive opiate began to crumble. By the early 1900s, the evidence was becoming undeniable. In Philadelphia, doctors at a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients noticed that their patients were becoming enslaved by the very drug meant to help them. They called it the heroin habit. Similar stories emerged from hospitals and clinics around the world. The drug that was marketed as a cure for morphine addiction was proving to be a far more cunning and vicious captor. People weren't just using it for coughs anymore. A recreational user subculture began to emerge. Individuals who had been introduced to the drug medically discovered its intensely euphoric effects. They started crushing the tablets and snorting the powder or dissolving the salts and injecting them for a faster, more powerful rush. The heroin fiend, a term that would become a staple of sensationalist journalism, was born. The heroic drug was revealing its true nature. It wasn't a savior, it was a predator, far more addictive and destructive than the morphine it was supposed to replace. The medical community had been duped, and the public was beginning to pay a terrible price. So what went so wrong? Why was heroin so much more addictive than morphine? The tragic irony is that the very chemical modification Felix Hoffmann made to create heroin was the key to its destructive power. When a person ingests heroin, it enters the bloodstream. The two acetyl groups that Hoffmann attached to the morphine molecule act like a chemical key. They make the molecule much more fat-soluble. This property allows diacetylmorphine to cross the blood-brain barrier, the protective membrane that separates the bloodstream from the brain, with incredible speed and efficiency, much faster than regular morphine. Once inside the brain, the body's enzymes quickly snap off those acetyl groups, converting the drug right back into morphine. So in essence, heroin is a high-speed delivery system for morphine. It's a Trojan horse. It smuggles a massive, potent dose of morphine directly into the brain's reward centers, far more quickly than if the person had taken morphine itself. This rapid, intense flood of morphine is what produces the powerful rush of euphoria that users describe. And it is this very intensity that makes it so profoundly addictive. The brain's chemistry is overwhelmed, creating a powerful psychological reinforcement that leads to compulsive use and a rapid escalation of tolerance. Bayer's chemists and pharmacologists had made a catastrophic error. They had focused on the compound's initial effects in the body, not what it became once it reached the brain. They had accidentally created a drug that was, by some estimates, 2 to 3 times more potent than morphine simply because of its delivery mechanism. The so-called cure for morphine addiction was, in fact, a supercharged version of the exact same drug, packaged in a more seductive and dangerous form. The science that was meant to create a safer alternative had, through a fatal oversight, created a far greater menace. By 1910, the tide of public and medical opinion had turned decisively against heroin. The initial praise had been replaced by alarm and condemnation. Newspapers, once filled with ads for heroin cough syrup, now ran lurid headlines about the growing scourge of heroinism. They told stories of respectable citizens turned into desperate addicts, of crime waves fueled by the need to secure the drug, and of the devastating impact on families and communities. The medical establishment began a process of public retraction. Articles in prestigious journals like the Journal of the American Medical Association warned physicians about the drug's insidious, addictive properties and urged them to stop prescribing it. Doctors who had once championed heroin now shared cautionary tales of their patients' decline. The problem had grown too big to ignore. Governments around the world were forced to act. In the United States, the growing crisis of opiate and cocaine addiction, largely fueled by the patent medicine industry, led to landmark legislation. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 was a pivotal moment. While not an outright ban, it was the first major federal law to control the distribution of narcotics. It required anyone who produced, imported, or distributed opiates to register with the government, pay a tax, and keep detailed records of all transactions. More importantly, it restricted the sale of these drugs to registered physicians and only for legitimate medical purposes, to be dispensed via a written prescription. This effectively removed heroin from the over-the-counter market. It could no longer be sold directly to consumers in syrups and elixirs. The era of easy access was over. Other countries soon followed suit, implementing their own controls and restrictions. The walls were closing in on Bayer's wonder drug. Faced with a mountain of damning evidence and growing international condemnation, Bayer's position became untenable. For a time, the company tried to defend its product. They downplayed the reports of addiction, suggesting they were exaggerated or that the problem lay with the patient's weak character rather than the drug itself. They continued to emphasize its therapeutic benefits, especially for terminal patients, but the scientific and social reality was overwhelming. The brand name that was once a symbol of heroic relief was now synonymous with addiction and despair. The damage to their reputation was immense. Reluctantly, Bayer began to phase out its promotion of heroin. By 1913, the company quietly ceased production of the drug altogether. They shifted their marketing focus to their other, far safer, blockbuster invention, aspirin. The name heroin, which Bayer had trademarked, became so toxic that the company eventually allowed the trademark to lapse. The word entered the public domain, forever shedding its association with its corporate creator and becoming a generic term for the illicit substance. The final nail in the coffin for medical heroin came from international action. In the 1920s and 30s, bodies like the League of Nations Health Committee moved to implement a global ban on the production and distribution of diacetylmorphine for medical use. By 1931, most industrialized nations had made it completely illegal, even for prescription. The short, catastrophic reign of heroin as a legitimate medicine was officially over. It had taken the world nearly 2 decades to recognize the monster it had welcomed into its homes. The story of Bayer's heroin doesn't end with its prohibition. By forcing the drug out of the pharmacy, the law inadvertently created a new, sprawling, and incredibly violent black market. The demand that had been cultivated by years of legal marketing and medical prescription didn't just disappear. It was simply pushed underground. The users who had become addicted when heroin was a legitimate medicine now had to turn to criminals to get their fix. This created the foundation for the illicit heroin trade that would plague the 20th century and beyond, fueling crime, disease, and untold human suffering. The legacy of heroin is a chilling and powerful cautionary tale. It's a story about the seductive allure of the miracle cure and the dangers of rushing a new drug to market without a complete understanding of its long-term consequences. It's a stark reminder of how easily the lines can blur between medicine and poison, and how corporate profit motives can sometimes eclipse public safety. The aggressive marketing, the downplaying of negative side effects, the claims of non-addiction, these are patterns that have echoed throughout pharmaceutical history. Bayer, the company that gave us one of the safest and most widely used drugs in history, aspirin, also gave us one of the most dangerous. Both were born in the same lab, by the same chemist, just 11 days apart. One became a symbol of relief, the other a symbol of ruin. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? As we look at the sophisticated drugs and treatments being developed today, which ones will we look back on in 100 years with the same disbelief and horror? What modern miracle might be hiding a monstrous secret, just waiting to be discovered? The story of heroin teaches us that when something sounds too good to be true, it very often is.